Hi all. Yeah. See where we're all hiding in our various little corners. Not physically seeing anybody, even though they might be quite close in some ways.
I like Daniel's is in some kind of lake there.
Mm. Yeah. All right, maybe we should get going. It's 9:45, and this is the Design 2 session. And I'm Susanne, and I think I would like to ask Germán to start sharing his screen because he will present the first paper by him and Nolwenn, Maudet, Wendy, Mackay, and Michel Beaudouin-Lafon. So Germán, take it from here, and I'd just like to remind everybody to mute yourself and to write when Germán is done. Write your questions in the chat, and I will call everybody. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanne. So hello everyone, my name is Germán, and I will be presenting Enact. So let me put this here. So designers and developers collaborate to create multiple interactive systems, such as websites, mobile applications, interactive installations. However, they have different backgrounds and tools. So how do professional designers and developers transition from these two activities? To better understand their practices, we conducted 3 studies that we presented at CSCW and reported in much more detail in the journal publication. But here I will just highlight the main problems during the designer-developer collaboration. So we found that the most common issues can be categorized in these 3 groups. First is reworking and redundancy, meaning the use of multiple unconnected representations of the same artifact, such as using multiple applications and file formats that cannot keep consistency between them. Also, work that was done in one representation, for example, in the storyboard by the designer, needs to be replicated in another, for example, in code by the developer, even if it is the same object we are talking about. Another category of problems are design breakdowns. We define breakdowns as impediments that needs to be solved before the design can be implemented. From top to bottom, we have a designer sending an artifact to a developer. This specification artifact, for example, in the first case, can lack some information that the designer knows, but he didn't communicate it. That's what we call missing information. In the center, another case is when the designer didn't consider a problematic case, but the developer needs that. That is called edge cases. And the final one is when the specification file and the implementation, they don't match. Due to time constraint, skill level, or some technical considerations, the developer cannot actually implement it. That's what we call technical constraints. And the final one is we analyzing the involvement of the developer in the project. We grouped 25 stories in a 2x2 matrix. The rows group the stories in standard and custom interactions, and the columns if the developer was involved early or late in the design phase. As you can see here, most of the project with custom designs and late developer involvement were either problematic or impossible to implement. So having a developer involved early in projects will solve all these issues. That was the reason of our second study. And what we found is while it helps, was not enough. So we conducted a 3rd study to understand better what causes these design breakdowns. And we found that breakdowns are partially byproducts of the limitation of the current representations. With these empirical findings, we established 4 design goals for the creation of a new collaborative tool for prototyping interaction that will encourage developers to participate early, to reduce reworking and redundancy, mitigate some of the design breakdowns, and going from examples to rules. We scoped the project to multi-touch interactions on a mobile device and created Enact. So Enact is a web application for creating custom multi-touch interaction collaboratively. It's composed of a storyboard, a timeline, a code editor, a state machine, a device mirror, and the mobile device itself. Let's explain the tool with a scenario. Ana, a designer, is collaborating with Pedro, a developer, and they will have many iterations over a particular design. Ana has an idea for a pan and tap interaction. She wants to drag existing objects with a finger and create new ones with a tap. So first, Ana uses the storyboard to draw the user interface. In a traditional storyboard, the designer needs to copy and paste if there are replication between the screens. But in Enact, changes in past screens are replicated automatically in future screens. So in here, you can see that when she draws an object in the first screen, it will appear in the second screen and also in the device mirror. Now she needs to specify the user input. For that, she will use the recording feature in the timeline to record a demonstration of this pan and tap interaction. Now she can associate each screen with a particular user input. So the first screen, we will relate it with the touch input that is represented with a gray circle. And she can use these inputs to accommodate her design. And in the second screen, she's showing that she dragged the greenish object and she's creating a new one with the second tap. Finally, with this information, she has two visual states. She has some time information with the user inputs. So the system can create an automatic keyframe animation based on this information. So she pressed the play button and she can see the final interaction, how it will look like. But still, this is not interactive. She needs to collaborate with a developer to create the actual implementation. So she will send this project, because it's a website, to Pedro. And now Pedro needs to implement this design. The first thing that Pedro does is checking the video specification. And next, when Pedro interacts with the phone, he can see the state machine reacting live. Now, to create this tap interaction, he needs to add a new state. He double clicks, change the name of the states, and create the corresponding transitions. And now he can check if this is working with the mobile device. Now he needs to connect inputs, in this case, the touch events, with outputs, the storyboard that Ana created. For doing that, Enact has a map function that connects input with outputs. So he writes map, and the template already fills input and output, and he will drag this object from the storyboard. In this case, he's dragging the first touch and asking for the position property, and dragging the shape object and asking for the position property. And with this mapping between position, he has a drag interaction. Notice that there is no reworking needed here, because Pedro was using the objects from the storyboard. He's not recreating this in his own tool. Let's move on. So now Ana can test the interaction. She can test it directly in the device and see if everything is working properly. Next, Ana wants to modify the design, of course. She wants to have a pinch interaction to scale the objects in the same, and at the same time move them. First, she records a new gesture, and the new gesture is shown in the storyboard, and she adjusts the design, in this case, making that bigger and adjusting the position. Now she sends the new design to Pedro. To create this pinch to scale, traditionally, Pedro will need to create an equation relating distances of fingers with the scale property of the object. But in Enact, measures are ray-fi objects visible in the storyboard. Pedro can use the measuring tool to create an object between the touch events and see it live in the device mirror for debugging purposes. Now he can use that to map the distance property of this measure with the scale property of the green object, greenish. And the scale is working directly in the device. Now, Ana would like to test this interaction, but instead of doing it live on the device, she wants to reuse the same demonstration that was initially used in the storyboard. So Enact has an assisted testing feature just for that. So by pressing the yellow button, the system will run the demonstration recorded with the current implementation. And now we can see the difference between the storyboard and the current implementation highlighted with a yellow dotted line. Now, Anna has two options. She either needs to fix the design or the implementation needs to be fixed. In this case, the design is incorrect and she wants to use the version proposed by the timeline. She can navigate all the potential solutions. But in the second case, she wants the implementation to be fixed. So for this, she will send the design to Pedro, and Pedro needs to add a threshold. In this case, the greenish object cannot go larger than a certain number. Instead of using trial and error, Pedro can drag this value by pressing Shift instead of Control from the storyboard itself. But this is not a dummy value, it's a live value. So now if Anna changes the design in the storyboard, she can actually change the implementation without the need of touching the code. Oof. Okay, so let's go quickly through the design goals and the different principles that we use on Enact. The first one is providing multiple viewpoints. So we have different ways of seeing the same interaction. So we have more friendly views like the storyboard, designer-friendly views, and more developer-friendly views. But we also have intermediate views like the state machines. We have a single source of truth, changes in one viewpoint change the others. We reveal the invisible, for example, with the measuring tool. And we support design by enaction, meaning the use of embodied demonstration with the recording feature on the input timeline. We compare Enact with traditional tools with a comparative study where we use two interactions, an initial version and a final version. And we found that we quantify how many times designers and developers actually use the device. Both designers and developers use more interaction with Enact than with traditional tools. So to conclude, all the pairs finished the initial task and the second task. Designers participated more when they use Enact. They found more edge cases and they have more opportunities for co-creation. So we identified current challenges, we introduced the principles, we implemented a tool, and we showed that increased participation facilitates discovery of edge cases and encourage co-creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Germán. Let's give Germán a hand for this. Please remember to write questions in the chat and I will call you. Meanwhile, perhaps, Germán, I wonder, this is of course a very particular model in a sense of collaboration between a designer and a developer. And I mean, I know it happens, I'm not saying that, but do you have any ideas of how general this kind of model might be for these kind of situations?
Do I have an extra slide? So basically during our interviews, we try to be extremely open with the type of organizations that we were interviewing. So we have people working in design agencies, in startups, and in collaborative spaces. And we noticed that the number of designers and developers wasn't that large. So this type of interaction is quite common. Instead of using maybe one tool, what they do is they use some designer tools, such as vector graphics, something like Sketch or Illustrator. And then they use plugins to help them extract the information for the developer. In the case of web application, will be CSS properties, for example. So it is a common model that you have designers and developers working alongside and using a bunch of emails or collaborative tools that have annotations and comments, and then trying to work it out back and forth. So I would say it's pretty common.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else who have questions? All right then, Karle.
There is a yes, I know her.
You know her?
Yes. She cannot unmute, so I think someone needs to do it.
Karle, I already unmuted you. So.
Yeah. Karle.
Okay, sorry. Yes, I was touching the button and I muted myself again. So, hola, Ger. And so I wanted to, I don't know if other people here saw your presentation yesterday, where you were also talking about some in-action ideas, but more for designing for AR. But in your previous project, still it looked that you were still interacting with static drawings that you did on screens, and the inactions and interactions between the graphical objects and interaction, the code that defines interaction isn't as rich as in Enact, as in this project here. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about whether you plan to combine these things, or in which other modalities do you think that you could apply this idea of enacting?
Germán, maybe by the way, could you stop sharing your screen?
I can stop sharing my screen. I think the idea of using demonstration to create interaction, it was pervasive in how designers communicate. So when we were talking with them and they were explaining some project, they were using their hands to say, yes, I have this pin gesture, I have this sliding. Even when they were talking about voice interaction, they were also using saying, and then I say, and they say the command. And with AR, I think it's the same. They will, for example, if they want to say, yes, I have this interaction over a plane, and they do with their hands like this, or I have this vertical plane. So I think using demonstrations in action, basically designed by an action, it can work for as many modalities as they have physical representations. So I think for creating rules for AR, for example, it will be really interesting if they could use their hands to say, okay, I'm detecting this plane, or I put in this anchor on this corner. So it's spatial, and the body is really, really good for that. As you said, in the previous project for AR, we only have illustration, not interaction, but I can see a model like the one we use here with Enact, also for AR.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Karger.
I'm done. So I think Midas also has a question.
Midas has a question, yes. I'm trying to unmute him.
Yes, I have unmuted. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the different contexts in which you did this system work versus the project that you presented yesterday. One of which was together with a company, and this one is very much by yourself. Like, where does this go next? How do you know, because there's a lot of work that goes into a system design like this. Like, how does this then become realized in some way? Do you have some kind of like path that you imagine for that? And would you argue for one approach over the other?
Thank you for the question. It was a completely different process, I would say. So the Enact project started in 2016. And the first paper from this project was in 2017. And then we tried to submit it to different conference, and well, it was a journal publication. So I would say it was a much larger project. It took 2.5 years, and recruiting designers, doing the experiment, figuring out, we have a lot of ambitions in the terms of goals. And in that time, we will see in a lot of commercial tools bringing some of these ideas. So I think they were catching up, let's say, in that time frame. If I compare that with the model that we have when we, in the other project that we collaborated with Adobe Research, I think the time frame was shorter and was much more focused. It was about AR. So I think both models are interesting. I think a project like this will require much more collaboration at large in order to make it become an actual tool that is ready to use, because designers and developers need something that is extremely robust to be used in their daily practices. And this one is an illustration in a sense. It's a research prototype. We can show several objects, we can show how this interaction goes, but if someone needs to do a mobile application from zero to publication in an app store, they cannot do it with this tool. So that's really sad in terms of studying that behavior, how this actually affect real practices. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question at large, but those will be my hints in this. Doing it open source is something that we want to do. We need to figure out some stuff with the French research institution. I really want to put this project as open source. We are not there yet, but as soon as it is, I will publicly put it on Twitter, the link, or somewhere else.
All right, thank you, Germán. Time flies, so I guess this was the final question. So thanks again to you and your collaborators, and then we will move on to Midas, who I hope will then share his screen, and you can, I guess you can unmute yourself, but now I think I've unmuted you. So this paper, I just want to say, has already drawn a lot of attention in the press. So we're just to raise everybody's expectations. This is presenting the paper that's written when he was basically on his day abroad at MIT with Ilaria, Liccardi, Michael Veale, David Karger, and Lalana Kagal, whatever. You got it. You can tell us the name.
Yes. So this is a paper I did with these people called Dark Patterns After the GDPR. I am trying to, for this track, put a little bit more design stuff in there, but it is a mix of both design and regulation. So bear with me if that is a new topic for you. But basically, in 2018, a new privacy regulation came into effect in the European Union, and this is kind of the first major effort of institutional governments to try and push back against the way that technology industry is, basically using a lot of our data as a profit model. And one of the things that is written in the regulation is that for the processing of your personal data, they need to acquire consent. And I think most of us, for the people who are not that much into this particular topic, you became aware of this change when you got a lot of emails about 2 years ago in your inbox saying, oh, we need your permission to keep sending you newsletters and other stuff, right? What actually counts as consent, however, isn't necessarily an unproblematic definition. It's really something that is at this moment divided over a bunch of different documents. So you have some of the articles in the GDPR that say this is what is consent. You have some stuff in previous regulation from the early 2000s. And then you also have case laws coming out where judges are interpreting the law and saying, oh, this is what counts as consent. But for the sake of this presentation and for most situations, consent is any kind of type of response that a data subject, so you as an individual, gives that is freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. So this is what you give to this particular company. I'll briefly touch on those, but I don't want to spend too much time on it because then we'll get lost in all the legalese. But freely given basically just means that you can say yes or no without getting any kind of or experiencing any kind of detriment, and that you should be able to withdraw your consent as easily as you give it. And that it also means that you can't, for example, give your consent if it's something that you need for a contract. So in an employment contract, that would never count as consent because there's a power relationship there. Then you have specific and informed, which means that when you give your consent, it needs to be for a specific purpose rather than saying, oh, I give consent for you to collect any kind of data that you want for eternity. It needs to be for specific purposes, and you need to be informed about who it is that you're giving it to. Then unambiguous means that it needs to be a really, really clear act on your part. So basically, somebody saying, oh, if you don't tell me you don't want it, that counts as consent, wouldn't actually be legally valid. And all of these things together basically mean that design of interfaces matter for legal compliance, because when you design an interface, it needs to actually allow a user to give consent in this way. This has become kind of a challenge for a lot of internet companies who collect a lot of your data when you browse websites. And so a new type of interface has popped up, which are kind of like a reinvention of the pop-up, which are called consent management interfaces. Now, what these look like, there's usually 3 screens to them. First, you have kind of like a bulk screen, which is like, oh, this is what we do. Do you accept this? Do you not accept it? So you give bulk consent to basically everything. And then there's a second level, which has more individual purposes, like, oh, would you want to turn on personalization, data collection, or information storage, or other things? And then lastly, there's usually some kind of vendor level, which is individual companies, and you can say yes or no to these. And these type of consent management platforms have become more and more popular. So here, the top graph is a trend line from 2018, showing how around 20% of publishing websites, or sorry, 35% of publishing websites, 20% of like most websites use these type of interfaces. And then the top graph is kind of the distribution of which companies are providing these, because usually these are third-party services on websites. These are not designed by the website themselves, but it's another commercial product. And what's interesting is that you now, at least in the UK, have about 5 different companies that service about 50% of the market, right? So there's a huge concentration in terms of who is supplying these interfaces and designing them. So which are these? So some of these might look familiar to you. Cookiebot is actually a Danish company and is one of the most popular ones. So this study that we did kind of asked 2 questions, which is first, okay, what are companies currently doing? What are these interface designs, and do they or do they not follow the legal requirements for consent? And then how does that design actually affect the choice of the users, right? And this is to dig more deeply into this question of freely given. And there's 3 research questions that we looked at for the design, which is, does the notification style of the pop-up change what you say? Do the options of the button? So if you have a reject button and an accept button, but they might be on different levels of these like 3, bulk, vendor, or purposes, does that do anything? And the level of granularity when you first go to a website. So for the first question about what are companies currently doing, we built a web scraper, and we found that 88% of websites are basically in violation of the law. Anecdotally, I think for most of us, this is not necessarily surprising because those pop-ups are very annoying and you never really feel like you have a free choice. But we kind of tried to put some numbers to this, right? So the things that they don't have is, for example, that they have boxes already pre-checked, which is not allowed because that's not freely given, that rejecting isn't as easy as accepting, or that, when they, you go to a website and you start scrolling and they count that as consent as well. There's a further breakdown of exactly how many, what the distribution of these things are for the different consent management platforms in the paper as well. And then the question of how does that design actually affect the choice? So the 3 questions we had, notification style being the first one, we actually found surprisingly that this had no effect. So we built a browser extension that we then tested with about 40 participants who didn't know that this is exactly what they were participating in. We said it was about something else, but sometimes they were shown European websites. And then we injected these fake pop-ups. So here you see one that's a banner notification, so that's at the bottom of the screen, and you see a barrier notification, which is kind of in the middle, right? And there is an ongoing discussion also for regulators saying, oh, these type of barriers, they shouldn't be allowed because that's forcing people to interact with it before they get to the website, so that isn't freely given. Except that our data actually shows that it doesn't have an effect on the consent answer. It does have an effect on whether or not people answer. So if there's a banner notification, usually it means that you can keep scrolling on the site, and we found that about they're like 3 times more likely to be ignored than the barrier. Then the other interface, which is about when you remove the reject button from the first page and put it on the second page. And so this had a massive effect. So the consent rate went up by about 22 to 23 percentage points. And we also found that I think at 97% of the time, people don't even bother going to the second page ever. So moving that to a second level actually has a huge impact. And then lastly, we had this question on, okay, what if you then change the level of granularity you see on the first page, right? Most of the times now you get just that yes or no option, or mostly just a yes option. But what if instead you showed, the companies as the first level when you go to a website? And in all of those cases, when you showed more granularity on the first screen, the consent rate actually went down with different degrees. But definitely when you show people the companies, then people were less likely to click accept. So like Susanne mentioned, this research got some attention in the media, both in international media and in Denmark as well. And that's also because I kind of like made an effort to push for it. just because this has been an ongoing problem, not just for the GDPR, but also for previous privacy regulation, that the enforcement of it is incredibly lacking. And so one of the funny or problematic things that we found is that also the Danish parliament and the Danish national broadcaster were also actually in violation of the law. And so what came after this, and this is not in the paper, but just to give you an update on the status, is that about a month after the media attention, the Danish Data Protection Authority, which is like the data police in different European member states, came out actually with new guidance for these type of pop-ups, which were then reported on as saying like, "Ooh, a bomb on the internet." You know, this is a groundbreaking new regulation. And we used the tool that we initially used to look at all of these designs to kind of measure the impact of this. And so in the graph, you see kind of like the baseline is when the new verdict came out. And then we've been tracking whether or not these pop-ups now have a reject button on the first page. And interestingly, which is actually a bit of a surprise to me, it went up for about 9% compliance to 29% last week. So I'm still tracking this, which really just shows that these enforcers can have an effect and can actually make people comply with the regulation better. If this doesn't work, which was kind of what was happening in between the paper being published and us waiting for the media attention, I guess, we weren't really convinced that anything would happen. We also built a browser extension that automatically answers these pop-ups for you. So you can install it, you can set your preferences, and rather than having to do it on every single website, it interacts with those pop-ups for you and then tries to kind of prevent you from being misled. So this is called Consent-O-Matic, and it's freely available on Firefox and Chrome and is also open source. And that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Midas. Again, please write in the chat if you got questions. I want to be able to see chat, that might be helpful. Yep. Let's see. I think we are, Peter Lyle, please, you can ask your question. Can you unmute yourself or do I need to? I can unmute you for sure.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for the talk, Midas. I followed a little bit of this stuff with what you've been doing, and it's quite interesting. One thing I was reminded of actually with that thing right at the end was that often these pop-ups and these things also include that sort of loading animation and the sort of web processing your preferences thing, and I've never quite been convinced that that's doing anything other than trying to sort of nudge people to not question the
Right.
tracking that's been going on. I was just wondering if that was actually something that you had looked at or had thought about looking at.
Yes, so I actually did, just out of personal curiosity, because it looked incredibly fake, because it kept being, I timed it basically. I was like, okay, it looks kind of the same. Then I looked into the code to try and figure out if anything was actually happening. I couldn't really see any network requests being made. So as far as I can tell, it's fake, but there might be something that I'm missing. However, even if it wasn't fake, it is still problematic because one of the kind of fundamental principles of this privacy regulation is called privacy by default and privacy by design, which means that the default setting should always be the most private setting. So the fact that when you want to opt out of something, they then have to do processing means that they have to change something. Whereas if they've done privacy by default, then it should be the other way around. So it's absolutely shit. It's also become kind of an issue with the extension that we built because basically it means that we can only automatically process these pop-ups as fast as the pop-up allows us. And so that means that, some people were complaining, I have to wait for a minute before it's fully processed. And that's something that we can't really do much about, except we're trying to hide it. But then because they sometimes count clicking on the page or clicking on the link as consent, that basically would then override our automator again. But yeah, no, it's shit. Like, it's terrible. It's very annoying.
Thank you. So I think next up is Clemens. Yep, I'll unmute you.
Yes, so thanks, Midas. That's great. Let's say that compliance goes up and people start using your extension. So this battle has been won. And what's the next battle?
So it's not just about pop-ups necessarily. The thing that I'm interested in is the overall, I guess, power struggle between these large companies and civil society or governments. And there's actually a great report that came out yesterday by Brave, which is a privacy browser, looking at the overall enforcement of the GDPR and how that's incredibly lacking as well. One of the things that was mentioned in this report is that I think in all of the data protection authorities across the EU member states, they only have about 1 to 2% of people with an actual technology background who are helping with these type of questions, right? And so the next stage, or the next thing that I would be interested in with these things, is try and help these type of regulatory authorities with data-centric approaches so that they can, like we did with this data, we can give some evidence to these authorities and be like, okay, here's the thing that we see is happening, and here's what we say would probably have the most impact if you pushed on this particular issue, right? Because I think that the kind of the impact that we had, at least in Denmark, with the DPA making that new guidance, was influenced by the fact that we had very specific information. And having talked to some of these people since then, they're often kind of flying blind, and most of them don't even know what are the most, what are the different third-party services that are in our national country, basically. So it's not just about pop-ups necessarily, but it's about using computational tools for regulatory enforcement in general. And I think this particular case is a much easier one because it's the web, which is an open platform, and you can kind of, as a third party, you can kind of see what's going on because you can look at the code. Whereas if you're then moving into, for example, how mobile applications are violating the regulation, it's much more difficult to do that type of inspection of that.
Right, thank you. I think we got like the time for a short question here at the end. So Ida is next on the list. So please, Ida.
Yes, thanks. Thanks for the work, Midas. And I'm just, first of all, really glad that this work was done. I think it's great. So I was just wondering, because you mostly addressed sort of the regulatory side of it, and the fact that even the National Broadcasting Service was not compliant clearly shows there are issues there. But I was wondering, there's also this very sort of low practical level where developers need to do this, right? And developers are not experts on this, right? So often they're asked to comply with this, but I have this suspicion that a lot of web developers are just copying patterns they see on other websites, or maybe even using the same code. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this and what part that plays in the problem.
Yeah, so there's two parts to this. There's the kind of, from an individual point of view, you have this thing of like consent fatigue, right? Which is kind of, we are becoming used to a certain type of interaction with these type of websites. And so that also affects how effective it even could be if we changed it now. And so with developers, for example, like you're saying, they're kind of, they might not look into the regulation necessarily, but instead be like, oh, well, this is what large companies are doing, so we assume that they are doing it right, so we'll follow this same type of pattern. And that has to do with, when you bring out this new type of regulation, you really kind of, you're building a new overall pattern of behavior in a population. And you need to make sure that it is then actually effectively enforced. Otherwise, you get this pattern that contradicts the aim of the regulation itself, right? And so this is really, at the moment, kind of the big struggle, which is effective enforcement of the GDPR. So that's one side of it, which is just more like, diffuse, how do people deal with this? But then you also have the very practical side of, it is actually very rarely individual web developers who build this stuff. And instead it's third-party services who you hire. And they obviously are expert in this because it's their product. And actually, having talked to some of them, especially the Danish ones, they're saying, oh yes, we are allowing these illegal designs as part of our product offering because it is the companies that ask for this, and it is not our responsibility. We inform them about what's legal and what isn't illegal, But this is similar to how a car is allowed to drive over the speed limit. It is the responsibility of the individual driver, which I have some ethical issues with. And so that's also one of the kind of the advices that we gave in the paper for regulators is, again, rather than going after individual websites, you should go after these very centralized players saying, okay, well, you guys need to all be compliant, because then that'll trickle down much faster to the rest of the web ecosystem. So I think, this question of, oh, the developers might not know is less important than here are some people who definitely do know, but say for their business model, this isn't something that we care about.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Midas. We don't have any more time. I'll just actually make you aware of the message from Marie-Louise in the chat, and I think is relevant for you. And on that, I think we should thank Midas again for the great work and talk. And let's see if we can then switch to Netta, who will do the next talk. And when I find the program, I'll tell you what it's about. Netta, can you start sharing your screen? So this paper is by Netta Iivari, Marianne, Kinnula, Leena, Kuure, and Tiina, Keisanen. So please, Netta.
Yes, hello everyone. Thanks for the introduction. And Marianne, you can wave your hand. Marianne is here to answer specifically all the difficult questions. But let's see, now I'm sharing the screen and let's go.
Hello, I'm Netta Iivari from University of Oulu, and this paper was written by me and Marianne Kinnula from Interact Research Unit in University of Oulu, together with Leena Kuure and Tiina Keisanen, who are from Research Unit for Languages and Literature. And in this paper, we explore humor as a resource in design and making. Why to study humor? Well, one can say that it is an integral part of our everyday life, and most of us are capable of experiencing and appreciating humor. We smile, laugh, and become amused of many things. Humor has been studied within many different disciplines and perspectives, but also in human-computer interaction there is existing research on humor, and it has been studied in connection to many different kinds of technological solutions like humor in games and gameplay, use of humor in social media, in human-robot interaction, in interaction with virtual agents, and so on. And more technical research has also been conducted on humor recognition, and humor has also been considered in connection to computer science education and also in design process, which comes closest to our study. And in those studies, humor has been intentionally integrated into the design process. And another approach has been to define principles for how to design humorous products and solutions. Our study has been conducted in collaboration with children, and basically one can say that humor in the lives of children has also been explored, and it plays an important role in child development and learning. It is used as a resource in socialization, identity building, in relation to relationship building, learning. In educational sciences, it has been emphasized that humor can definitely be integrated into education and learning that is seen as valuable. And in HEI, it has been discussed also relating to technology use as well as design, and humorous design activities have been defined to be used with children, and children's design outcomes have also been studied and shown that they include humor. But as a motivation for our study, we still claim that surprisingly little HEI research has been conducted on humor, studying it without intentionally evoking it, but basically studying its existence, the roles it plays naturally occurring as part of our design process. And there is also lack of studies of this kind in collaboration with children and teenagers. And this is where our study contributes. And for this study, we have been doing a lot of reading on humor, and of course, a lot can be found within different disciplines, most notably psychology. And you can find different kinds of theories on humor, categorizations, functions of humor. Like for different theories, relief theory emphasizes release of tension with humor. Inconcrete theory emphasizes oddness and violation of what is expected. Superiority theory emphasizes laughing at others and kind of feelings of triumph, ridiculing others. And humor has also been categorized to be directed at the self or the others and being benign or detrimental. And based on this, you can identify self-enhancing, affiliative, aggressive, self-defeating types. And humor can be used for identification, clarification, enforcement, differentiation, different types and functions. But we advocate situated perspective on humor, and then you are studying it in situ from people's perspective, how it emerges and is used as a resource in interaction. And our background and inspiration comes from discourse and interaction studies. Particularly, we are fascinated by nexus analytic research strategy and theoretical framework. And that emphasizes that when you're studying people's interaction in situ, you should be looking at participants' historical backgrounds, experiences, what kind of relationships and interaction orders are emerging among them, how the space affects, what kind of discourses are kind of intermingled with the space and circulating around at the societal discourses, in situ discourses emerging in this situation. And from this perspective, we have been studying humor in this case. This study has been conducted in collaboration with a comprehensive school in Finland, in Oulu, and particularly in collaboration with a class of 9th graders and their teachers. And this was part of their multidisciplinary learning module, which included entrepreneurship education, English, and so on, different types of subjects. We have collected different kinds of data from this project, but most important data was these video recordings of design and making workshops in collaboration with these teenagers. And in the analysis, we originally did not have humor as a focus, but it emerged as one very interesting topic, theme in the data. And we have been individually and collaboratively viewing and analyzing this material and utilized these nexus analytic concepts as sensitizing devices in our data analysis, making sense of humor. Through our collaborative analysis, a WIG group became focus of our attention. There seemed to be a lot of humor emerging within that group, and they were designing and making this fancy technology-enhanced wig. And we revealed this situated emergent nature of humor as a resource in interaction within this group in many different senses, for example, relating to face work and impression management that was ongoing among these teenagers in the middle of design and making. And many different kinds of usages of humor emerged. These teenagers were creating, maintaining relationships amongst themselves, and there were their existing teachers as well as new adults, researchers entering the classroom, and a lot of usages of humor could be identified in these situations. And they were negotiating totally new design and making related tasks and humor pictured in those negotiations, and relating to mutual relationships as well. And clearly humor was related to relieving of tension because new people, new tasks were emerging, and it was uneasy situation in different senses. Division of labor within this group and also in other groups was an issue, and humor pictured in those situations also clearly. So we identify the following implications from our work. We recommend supporting and facilitating these benign forms of humor in the classroom. When you're working with children as well as with adults, there are many positive aspects relating to humor for building group cohesion, maintaining of relationships, stress, tension relief, face work, impression management. Those are important things for people, not only teenagers, but also for them. And we also recommend, when you're doing that, to approach this classroom as a complex microcosmos. It is a multifaceted constellation of people, objects, tools, relationships, discourses. It is a stage with particular kinds of performances going on, and you need to be studying these backgrounds of people, their relationships, what the space affords, advocates, prohibits, and how discourses picture in that when you're planning how to nurture humor in there. And we also emphasize this very self-reflective, responsible, ethical stance towards humor with teenagers as well as with adults. There are also problematic usages of humor, and you have to really carefully consider what you advocate and nurture when you're introducing humor into the situation. And we also finally want to emphasize our data showed that among these teenagers, there was clearly balancing going on between doing serious stuff as well as arsing around. And we want to highlight that this is significant consideration with children, teenagers, and adults. Like when you're doing design and making related activities, there is this balancing and dynamics going on relating to really doing the job as well as having fun and doing crazy stuff in the middle, and both should be valued and appreciated.
Thank you, Netta. Please write in the chat if you have questions for Netta. I could maybe meanwhile say that, I mean, very many years ago when I worked a lot with people in workplaces getting new technologies, as it was called, we were quite often using a video by John Cleese about the choice of office technology. And the video, I think he actually was paid by Olivetti or some of the big office manufacturing at the time to do this, was called Two Sisters or something like that. And it gave this very lovely anecdote about the two sisters who were each working for their boss. And one, of course, the good boss was John Cleese, and he gave, the bad boss was John Cleese. The good boss gave this woman all the technologies she would desire, whereas the other guy was this mean guy who wouldn't buy any technology. And anyway, it seemed to me that this very ironic way of presenting the positives and the negatives of actually having technology in the workplace worked quite well for people. And so I was just thinking, other than the fact that this is actually something that was probably produced in the around 1980. I was just thinking, you know, have you thought about actively using, I mean, maybe something that's even more like caricatures also in these design processes?
We haven't yet considered this, like together with Leena and Tiina, who are discourse interaction analysis people, we have been now focusing on this, appreciating this as a naturally occurring phenomena. But definitely, like, we are now very interested in critical design, speculative design, design fiction, and definitely this type of stuff could play, and always will play a role, but it could be kind of intentionally integrating aspects, but we haven't done anything yet.
Right, Marie-Louise, you have a question. Let's see if I can unmute you, if I can find you. There she is.
Talk, Netta. Actually, I have two questions, and then you can decide which one you want to answer. So I've done research in speculative design, especially in topics such as reproductive and sexual health. So my first question is related to this humor. How do you see it being introduced? Is it through the facilitator of workshops? Is it through the materials? Is it through specific sort of like design methods? So where, like, how does this humor come into being? And the second is there specific topics where you see this humor being used? So for instance, in the topics of reproductive and sexual health with teenagers, we've been thinking about a lot about using humor.
Well, basically in the literature also you can find suggestions that you can use kind of humorous materials, or you can consider tasks that are somehow considered humorous. Of course, it's very difficult to say what all is and by whom considered as humorous. That's another question. But of course, when researchers, designers are meeting these people in your own behavior, in your small talk, everything, so you can consider it from so many different perspectives. But in your context, I think it's kind of naturally occurring, considering this relief of tension. Actually, in our data, we have these examples that these teenagers used quite dirty humor, and it was kind of sexuality oriented stuff that was kind of said and done. And so I would say that in your cases, it is emerging probably naturally. You cannot avoid it. If people feel a little bit uncomfortable, it's emerging no matter what you do. But of course, you can kind of plan for it as well and should consider it in advance.
All right, thank you. We have a question from Sophia. Unmute you, I think.
Test.
There's something with the unmuting, I think.
Wait.
Now I think you're
yes,
on.
Now you can hear me. Sorry. It's a really it's a real back and forth. Sorry for that. Thank you for your talk, Netta. I was thinking about maybe the obvious issue or the obvious question here. Humor, of course, always has cultural implications, right? And so maybe that's a bit of a follow-up question to Marie-Louise, who was talking about like teenagers as maybe a target group. It felt like you opening up for like quite general entrance here, like both aiming for children, youth, adults. But I think, of course, they're all humor is very different to both age groups, but also culturally has a lot of differences. How were you reflecting on that?
Actually, in the Kai paper, the review team also forced us to write probably even several paragraphs on this aspect. So definitely it is significant, and we have been contemplating on it. Like, in a sense, humor is universal, but then again, it's very specific to people situations, age groups. You can identify like numerous distinctions. And we also considered this aspect of us kind of old people trying to interpret young people's humor. There are so many challenges, but generally you can recognize it from certain kind of science and certain kinds of evidence, but then again you should be talking to people as well, and definitely you need to know with whom you are working and what kind of is considered humorous from their perspective, so it doesn't really same things don't work everywhere all the time. But these different humor theories, even like we didn't have too much time to make this slideshow, but we tried to include like a little bit different types of humor into those pictures even. So it's such a complex concept, and yeah, you need to carefully consider what is humorous for whom.
All right. I would like to yet again thank Netta and everybody in this session for some really interesting presentations and some good questions. This session is coming to an end and there will be more. Unfortunately, some of us have to go and teach, but I guess the rest of you get to hang out and hear more nice presentations later today. Thanks for joining this this session, and I guess the next will start in 15